1985. For the Oral History Project of Madison History, we'll be talking with Robert Paunack, P-A-U-N-A-C-K of Madison. My name is Lorraine Orchard. Okay. Do you mind if I call you Bud?
No.
All right, that's how I know you. I already introduced you as Robert, but let's say Bud. Can you tell me something about your family? When did they come to America, and where did they come from, and anything like why did they come, or what did they do? Anything. It'd be good to get that background.
My dad's name was August Oscar Jr., and his father, of course, was August Oscar Sr., who came over here from East Prussia, presumably in 1848, and A.O. Sr. was presumably also born near Königsberg, East Prussia. We were never able to find out the exact name of the town. Maybe someday I can get back over there and talk to the Russians and we'll find out. And A.O. Sr.'s wife, Johanna, came from Saarbrücken. I've been over there several times, but I don't find anybody by the name of Fahrenbruck, which was her maiden name, who was still listed in Saarbrücken, which is a town, at least as large as Madison. And on my mother's side of the family, my other grandmother was Scotch-Irish and lived in Milwaukee. Her father was a skipper on one of the commercial sailing boats out of Milwaukee. Her name was Ida Lee, L-E-I-G-H. She was married to Charlie Reinhardt, whose parents originally came from Stuttgart in Germany, and Charlie Reinhardt owned and operated a mitten factory in Milwaukee at the corner of 4th and Clybourne, which is now the place where the interstate comes in from Madison and heads up downtown.
When did they come to America?
Well,
1930, did you say, or?
Oh, I don't know at the moment when my grandmother's and grandmother and grandfather from Milwaukee and their folks came to the States. But in my dad's case, he came over here. My grandfather, from Madison, came over here from Prussia in 1848. Yeah. And grandmother, Johanna Fahrenbruck, arrived sometime after that.
Did they come right to Madison? And somebody went to Milwaukee, and then how did they get to Madison?
I really don't know. We tried to piece all this information together when my aunts and my dad were still alive, and they never put any of this stuff down on paper. So
sounds
typically
is right.
So we haven't been able to do much tracing back, except that before they passed away, the only information that we could garner was that A.O. Sr. and Johanna came directly to Madison, and why and how, I don't know, except that that's probably on that particular boat, they must have had some special excursion that wound up here in the capital city. As I recall, and I was too young at the time to appreciate what the situation was, but based on my dad's stories, apparently A.O. Sr. brought over with him from East Prussia a cousin or a young nephew's. The older of the two was Eddie Ponnock, who was basically a stonemason, and Fred Ponnock also, the other, I believe he was a cousin, was not only a stonemason but a builder. And Fred constructed what is now known as the Plough Inn, P-L-O-U-G-H, on lower Outer Monroe Street, I suppose you'd say, and on what is now Monroe Street and the Verona Road, which was the main stagecoach line coming in from Mineral Point back in those days, and the Plough Inn, as well as the still in existence red brick building right across from the springs up around the corner near the intersection of Verona Road and Monroe Street, were two of the major stopover places back in the middle 19th century for people traveling between Mineral Point and Madison. The masonry building business and the consequent building and use of Madison sandstone for a time was originated through the use of stone from what is now the Hoyt Park Quarry. At that time, back in the 1850s and 60s, and I don't know really how long it continued, Eddie Ponnock either owned and operated, or at least operated, the quarry. And the stone was blasted out of the quarry and then hauled down in chunks by oxen and horse team down what is now University Avenue to the stone yard, which was located back of the present Milwaukee Road Depot and the Washington Hotel. At the stone yard, the raw stone from the quarry was cut into various size blocks and was a major ingredient in the construction at that time, because of course in those days there was no cement factories that made block or any type of other building material. I don't know for sure, but the old Barnard Hall that stood at the corner of Park and University Avenue was typically built of this type of stone, as is the Grace Episcopal Church on the square, Chi Psi Fraternity House at 150 Iota Court, and many other buildings that are still standing, all used either stone from that quarry or similar stone from other quarries that were opened after that time. My grandmother, after A.O. Sr. passed away, and incidentally, I never knew him. He died before I was born. Lived in a house just next to the corner of Park and University Avenue on the east side of the street. The building on the corner was, as I recall back when I first remember going down there, used to be a pharmacy, I thought.
I thought it was a drugstore there, too.
A drugstore.
I remember.
And they were on the corner. My grandmother owned the house right next to it on Park Street, and she took in students for room and board at from the university. Going down the other way on University Avenue, the first building next to the drugstore was the Mott's building, and as I recall, Bernie and Mott's and his parents lived upstairs, and there was some kind of commercial establishment on the ground floor. The next was a small home that was occupied by Fred and Minnie Bramer. Minnie was A.O.'s oldest sister, and Fred Bramer used to operate a tavern up on State Street, which was either in or next to the former Houseman Brewery there at the corner of State and West Gorham Street. And getting back to University Avenue again, next to Minnie's house was where I always call him Uncle Eddie Pontiac lived, the fellow that operated the stone quarry. And I remember him because he had a big backyard, and we always had a lot of grapes back there. Next to him was a Chinese laundry, and that's about all I can remember from that area down there.
Great.
Freddie Pontiac, who was apparently about the same age as A.O. Sr., also passed away before I ever found out about him or knew who he was. When my sister Jean and I were born, she's a year younger than I, A.O. and my mother, Marion Reinhardt, were living in the second floor apartment in one of two nice three-story brick apartment buildings on West Washington Avenue, on the site of what is now the Wisconsin Power and Light Company building. I don't remember those days, of course. My memory goes back to 2103 Madison Street, where A.O., my mother, moved apparently when we were probably 4 or 5 years old. And we lived at that location until 1930, when my dad bought the Otto Tepfer, T-O-E-P-F-E-R, the Otto Tepfer farm out on Mineral Point Road at the corner of Tepfer Avenue and Mineral Point Road.
With that lovely red brick house?
In the big red brick house.
Oh, that's a beauty.
Yeah. And back in those days, Westmoreland consisted of the Westmoreland Golf Course on the west end, where the Queen of Peace Church is now, and it ran from there east to what is still the municipal golf course, and next to the cemeteries. The red brick house that Otto Tepfer had built at the corner of Tepfer Avenue and Mineral Point Road was the only building there at the time. Otto Tepfer had owned all that property that faced on Mineral Point Road and ran all the way south to the railroad tracks, and bordered on the west, of course, by the Westmoreland Golf Course. Otto had platted out the whole area and put in streets, but the only thing that I recall when we first moved out there was an abandoned concrete water trough down in about halfway down to the Illinois tracks, and everything else was vacant because when the Depression came along, almost as soon as we moved out there, A.O. was trying to sell those lots, and he couldn't give them away. He sold one lot to Uncle Fred Bramer at the, I forget, it's about 2 blocks down on Tepfer Avenue for $450. And then Ben Backus, who was working at the bank at that time, bought a lot in back of us and built a home there. And things gradually started to move along, but when we first moved there in 1930, it was very quiet along the real estate market.
Right. Do you remember much about your life on Madison Street? I remember your house. I went to birthday parties there.
Oh, yeah.
Jeans.
Yeah. We, at Wingler Park in those days, of course, it was a relatively new suburb, and Madison Street was quite an active area because of all the kids in the neighborhood. We lived at the corner of Madison and Lincoln, and going west was Professor Van Hagen, and whose sons were Bob and Charlie, who was in school with us, and his daughter Jean. Then next to them were the William Polk seniors. Young Bill was a classmate of mine and had just recently retired just outside of Philadelphia, where he was employed for many years and involved with the transportation development on the outer area of Philadelphia, railroad lines particularly. Then next to him were the Callahans, Gary and Marion. Gary was one of the older boys, and so we didn't associate with him too much. Marion was in school with us, and of course went on to become quite a famous golfer, both in Madison and in the state. Then there was a vacant lot, and on the other corner, the corner of Edgewood Avenue in Madison, lived the Coxons, and C-O-X-O-N. And Louise married Attorney Brown, who later became the
Fred? Or
Tim? Yeah, Tim Brown.
Tim, yeah.
Tim Brown.
Oh, that's Louise Brown.
And all of the coal booms lived across the street, and they moved west, back in the, must have been the late 20s. Mrs. Colbohm, C-O-L-L-B-O-H-M, was a widow with, I think they had 4 kids. And my dad was helpful in getting Franklin, the oldest boy, a job with Douglas Aircraft people. And of course, at those days, the airplane business was just getting off the ground, and Franklin later became quite well known on the West Coast and remained with the company, as far as I know, all of his working life. His the Colbohm's contribution to the neighborhood excitement was a 7-passenger Stanley steamer. And when Franklin would get ready to go somewhere, he had to go out and start the kerosene boiler in the car and get the steam worked up, and then would cruise up around the neighborhood with the radiator cap off so that the thing looked like a steam engine puffing around the area. And the Howard Weiss and the Weiss girls lived up on the corner of Monroe Street and Madison.
Yeah.
And Howard was quite well known as one of the founders. In fact, I think he did invent the batteries that Burgess Battery started manufacturing here. Down on Madison Street, again, shortly before we moved out to Westmoreland in 1930, the O'Malleys moved in there, and Bob, who's now president of the United Bank, appeared on the scene at a rather late date. Going east on Madison Street were the Smiths. I forget what the father's name was, and next to them were the Kellys. Louis Kelly was a neighborhood of ours, and then Barney Birch and his sisters all lived next to them, and then the Johnsons lived next to them. Emily subsequently married Walter
Heller.
Walter Heller,
Yeah.
who they moved to Minneapolis after going to school, after leaving school here. And Walter, of course, became, and is still known as quite an economist. And then beyond that, that was all Indian country down there. We didn't associate with those people. So when we left that area and moved out to Westmoreland, we got out just in time to open up West High School in 1930. And I was in the class of 1933, and at our 50th reunion 2 years ago, we had quite a turnout, and it must have been a couple of hundred people back for the big function. Some of the better known alumni are people like Betty and Jim Geisler, I can't.
See, it was Dick Bardwell in your class?
Dick Bardwell, and Bob and Evelyn
Grady?
Grady, yeah. The Gradys, just to name a few.
Did you play in Vilas Park very much?
Well,
when you were a child, or
no,
stay on your street?
We the only time we had much occasion to get involved with Vilas Park was in the wintertime, when the big activity then, of course, was sliding down Madison Street Hill from Jefferson Street, and the Bloodgood, Reverend Bloodgood, he used to be the pastor at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church, lived about halfway down the hill, and we used to zap down there, not worrying too much about traffic because there wasn't much, and we used to take our flexible flyers and zoom off the embankment down at the bottom of the hill and see how far we could belly flop and without crashing down at the bottom.
When I think of your family, I think immediately of the Commercial State Bank. Would you like to tell us something about the history of the bank? Or I know it has been very close to you, too,
Yeah.
and I associate you with that, of course. Or is there something else you want to talk about first,
Well,
between the stone quarry and your family's history and the bank?
No, nothing at the moment that I can think of. When my dad got out of high school, with 4 other brothers and sisters, and Grandma Ponick taking in boarders to support the whole clan, he didn't feel it was propitious for him to try to go to the university. So he started, got a job as a, well, he had, previous to that time, he had been working part-time as a messenger at the Bank of Wisconsin, which is now occupied by M&I Bank on the corner of Monona Avenue and Main Street. So that was a natural course to take, and so he stayed on there for a while, and then finally had an opportunity to go down to Milwaukee and work in what was then known as the Second Ward Savings Bank, which the First Wisconsin Bank at that time had purchased and was operating. So A.O. spent several years down there learning the business, and then while he was there, he met my mother. The Reinhardt family lived up on Milwaukee Street, which was just several blocks from that general area, which was basically Water Street between Wisconsin Avenue and over by the Schlitz Brewery and all those major developments up along the river, basically north of Wisconsin Avenue. So when A.O. decided to come back to Madison, he thought it was time to, felt it was timely to try to start another bank in town. At that time, the First National was in business at their present location, and the Hobbinses were running the American Exchange, which is at that time known as the German American Bank. I don't know if there was probably another bank somewhere up on the square. I think it might have been the old Capital City Bank. But anyway, when A.O. came back, he was looking around for someone to help him put the thing together, and he had gotten involved quite extensively with the La Follettes, who were held in high esteem, of course, at that time, and Bob Sr. Had started the progressive movement, and A.O. was quite taken with that aspect of the political scene, because he felt that the Republicans were too overly conservative and the Democrats were too overly liberal, and the progressives seemed to fit right in between. So he was quite involved with the progressive movement, and got acquainted with a fellow by the name of Sol Leviton, who came to be one of the local characters. Sol's background was that I guess he emigrated from Russia. I don't know exactly where he came from, but he was quite a picturesque character, as I recall him. Kind of a short man. He had always, by the time I got to know him, I could remember him, he was probably in his 70s, and had developed a kind of a characteristic at that time of being a well-known politician, and I think he served for 8 or 10 straight terms as treasurer for the state. He was also deeply involved with the La Follettes, and Sol had started out as a peddler who literally had a one-horse shay and peddled trinkets and clothing, starting down around New Glarus. I think that's where he landed when he got over here and got off the boat, and didn't speak any English, as I understand it, when he first got here. But then as his territory expanded and he gradually worked his way up to Madison, got acquainted with politics, and he was quite a talker, a very glib talker and was, with his accent and he developed a Van Dyke beard, which kind of set him out from the crowd. And he developed quite a rapport with all of the many of the farmers in the area, because that was his principal trade, was selling to the farm community, which in those days was the way business was done, because in order to come to town, a farmer would typically have to hitch up the team and spend probably a day getting into town and then spend all night or most of the next day getting back out. So when the traveling salesman came through, it saved everybody a lot of time and money. Saul was, of course, well known in the area, and when A.O. was looking around for someone to work with and developing credibility and a source of funds to sell the capital stock in a new bank, he enlisted the efforts of Saul, who agreed to serve as the first president, and some of the other people at that time were Adolph Menzies, who was well known in town, a very well known druggist who had a drugstore at the corner of North Carroll and East Mifflin, where the 30 on the Square building now stands. And I've forgotten all of some of the original stockholders. There were, and I don't know how long it took A.O. and Saul to round up all this money, but of course back in those days, capital requirements were relatively negligible, and there were the regulatory agencies were more or less non-existent, so that it was a matter of developing a rapport and going around selling stock in relatively small blocks, like Bill Levieux was doing, or did shortly thereafter when he set up the Capital Times. And so back in 1907, the A.O. and Saul basically and their organizing group had raised enough capital to open the Commercial National Bank at that time, and they set up business at on a permanent basis in what was then a new building known as the Madison Building at the corner of 102 State Street, and the bank occupied that location until we subsequently joined the Marine Corporation in 1980, and that building was sold, and what had been Commercial State Bank, which was the successor of Commercial National, which came about during the Depression in 1933, the building at 102 State Street was sold, and the bank moved down to the building that had been occupied by the Madison Gas and Electric Company at the corner of North Fairchild and East Mifflin, in order to provide larger quarters and more facilities. We could put in a drive-in and bring our operation up to date.
When did you join the bank then?
When I was when I got out of school at university in 1938, my first job, and was lucky to get a job back in those days, was with the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the president of which was Leo Crowley, who lived over on Edgewood Hill, and he was a great compatriot of Franklin Roosevelt. So when the FDIC was first established, Roosevelt called on Leo, who had had considerable experience operating the Bank of Wisconsin back here in Madison. So Leo went down to Washington and set up the FDIC in 1933, I believe it was. So I had a chance to go down to Washington as an accounting clerk with a corporation in 38, and stayed down there for 3 years. And in 1941, wanted to leave Washington. I was getting fed up with the place, and I had a chance to switch over to the U.S. Engineer Corps, which at that time was about to embark on developing airfields around the world, and one of the fields to be developed was Trinidad and Barbados in the British West Indies. I had a chance to join the Engineer Corps as a civilian accountant because the bases were being built on a cost plus fixed fee, and so the government, through the engineers, through the U.S. Engineer Department, was supervising the construction and of these bases. I got down there in September of 41, and on December 7th that year we were down taking a sightseeing trip through the Caroni Swamp, which is down in Trinidad, very large, swamp full of flamingos, a lot of extra flora and fauna. And when we got back to Dockside that afternoon, we heard the war had been declared on December 7th. So the Americans who were there were required to stay there for the next 2 years, and finally, a year and a half after war was declared, the government decided to build an air base over on Barbados, and so I volunteered to go over there, and I went there, and we got the place built in 6 months. Then I decided to come home, got drafted in the Army, and spent 17 weeks in basic training down at Fort McClellan, and then shipped overseas, and as a replacement in the infantry, landed in Naples and around the 1st of April of 43, and finally wound up in the 88th Division, and left there. I got wounded in Italy, and then spent the rest of the war with the up in France with the headquarters for the supply operation for the 7th Army. But when I got home, and I was discharged at Camp Grant on New Year's Eve of 1945, and immediately returned to Madison and started working at the bank. And then when A.O. passed away on June 6th of 1954, I was elected president of the bank and stayed there until we joined the Marine Corporation in February of 1980. Might be interesting to note that during the war, after I got out of the General Hospital in Rome and was transferred over to the Continental Advanced Section, of whom or for whom Ralph Immel, General Ralph Immel, was the the second man in command. And so I joined the advanced section after it had gotten up to move from the landing beach at Marseille up to Dijon, Dijon, which was the home of the original Dukes of Burgundy, and is quite a picturesque town. It's about 235 miles due east of Paris, and at that time in the winter, by that time it was getting into winter of 1945 and 1944. So that was the basically the winter line, and while I was in the headquarters section there in the statistical section. Part of the program that the Red Cross set up for all the GIs who were stationed in town particularly was to develop a liaison with as many of the French civilians as they could get to volunteer. There was another guy in the headquarters outfit with me by the name of Johnny
Graves.
Who?
Graves.
Yeah, Johnny Graves, and he and I volunteered to join the program. We were assigned by the Red Cross office to a couple who ran a butcher shop, and of course, as you might appreciate, food was in rather short supply for civilians back in those days, and the couple's name were Gaston and Marie Meunier, Meunier, real typical Frenchies. So we were invited every Saturday night to the Meuniers for dinner, which consisted of the usual 7 courses, and although probably not as elaborate as it would be these days, it was nevertheless a very nice place for Johnny and me to spend a Saturday evening. One of the main problems was that the Meuniers did not speak any American, and we didn't speak any French, so we gave the dictionaries a real workout. Neither Johnny nor I smoked, being good American boys, so we took our tobacco and rations and other goodies we could procure from the PX, coffee and some candy, peanuts, things like that, along with us, that we left with the Meuniers, especially for Gaston, because he was a typical Frenchman who was an inveterate smoker and who had really nothing but pretty stinky tobacco to work on back in those days. So anyway, we spent the winter there. And at that time, the Meuniers had 2 children. The third one was born after we left. And so we moved on in the spring of 45, and I went over the Rhine at Mannheim on the Ponton bridges about a day or two after the infantry went through. Mannheim was a town about the size of Milwaukee. It was pretty flat, no buildings standing, and we moved on and were stationed out at the SS barracks out at Seckenheim, which is on the Neckar River, about halfway between Mannheim and Heidelberg. And I still have a wall clock here that I found in one of the rooms at the SS barracks that shipped home to my sister, and she kept an eye on it for me until I got home. Well, to get back to the Meuniers, I kind of lost track of them after the war, except that I used to write them Christmas cards occasionally. And then I started to get involved with skiing, and Bob Fish and I got out to Aspen in 1953 when there was hardly anything in town. And one thing led to another, and finally, back in the 60s, I started to spend some time skiing overseas. And as a result, I had an opportunity to renew my acquaintance with the Mouniers in Dijon, and always use that as a place to stop over when we finished skiing at either Switzerland or Austria or France. And we developed quite a rapport. Gaston used to, when I would arrive, I usually spent 2 or 3 days with the family. And Gaston and Marie had never learned any more English, and I hadn't learned too much more French, but we still maintained our acquaintanceship. Then, after spending several left his widow and in good shape financially, and she occupies now a third-floor apartment in downtown Dijon, which, as you can imagine, in these older French buildings that were built, I don't know, 1,000, 1,500 years ago, they have been updated as best they can be. And her, if we find out after several visits and admiring all of her antiques, that she apparently came from a fairly well-to-do farm family, and her mother and grandmother were great aficionados of Louis the XIV, I think, artifacts of one type or another, and so her apartment is well loaded with bronze lions and tigers and other juicy Louis the XIV artifacts, furniture and things like that. So anyway, when Arlene and I made our first visit some 7 or 8 years ago, Marie decided to make a major function out of the operation, so she had the 3 kids and all their families and children over to one of the local better-known hotels for an Sunday afternoon soiree. Well, by the time Renee, the oldest of the 3 children, is now 45 years old, and Zet is now, she was the second oldest, she's about a year or 2 younger, and then Dee Dee, the youngest of the kids, who's still gotten married and has a couple of kids of his own, were all there with their families, so we had quite a reunion. And so every time we go back there now, we always stop in to see Marie, who likes to have company because Zet and her family live up in Lyon, and the other 2 people, the other 2 boys, live in town, but she is now she's probably now 79 or 80 years old and doesn't get around too much anymore. But about 3 or 4 years ago, she insisted that she wanted to come over and visit us, which we were happy to accommodate her. So lo and behold, on my birthday, October 15th of 1982, I believe it was, Marie arrives on the airplane from Dijon. And this was her first time in an airplane and her first time out of France, and so she spent a couple of weeks with us here, and we took her to all the football games and bought her a Bucky Badger hat, and she thoroughly enjoyed herself. So she now calls us periodically, at least once every week or 2, to give us an update on the weather and everything else in Dijon. And so we always make it a point whenever we get overseas to visit her as and she and all the older people in Dijon are still quite outspoken and very faithful to all of the GIs who came over to liberate them, the country. The younger kids don't pay too much attention to the GIs anymore, I don't think. But the older people still like to see us over there. And as a result of our skiing, we have also developed some fine friendships with a couple from Nancy who just retired, but they have a condominium up at Val d'Isère, and also our German friends that we ski with that come from Munich and come over here quite often. We all ski together and have quite a time.
I think you're ambassadors of goodwill with those ties with Europe. When I, by the way, think of your family, I think of civic contributions too, you and your father. And one thing I think of is the Capitol Theater, which is now, of course, our Madison Civic Center. Didn't your father have something to do with the Capitol Theater?
When A.O. and Saul were, after they'd gotten the bank started back in the 30s, and had also become involved in the moving picture business. And at one time they jointly owned and operated the Strand and the Parkway and the Madison Theater. And subsequently they felt that the State Street could support one more good theater, and so they were instrumental in building the Capitol Theater.
Excuse me, will you remind us where the Strand and Parkway were? I think some people don't know.
Well, the Strand Theater, the Strand is still in its present location. The Parkway is not was located right next to what was then the City Hall at the corner of Wisconsin Avenue and East Mifflin Street, where the present Woolworth the dime store exists. And the Parkway was part of what is now the just about where the Brathaus II is located. And that was the site of the Al Jolson's first talkie movie back in, I think it was 1928, 26, somewhere along in there. But the Capitol Theater was completed just before the Depression hit, about in fact, it opened in 1928, because I remember being in the front row in the balcony on opening night. 28 and 29, of course, were very prosperous years, and then the roof fell in on everything. And as A.O. told me later, he sold his interest, I don't know how much it was, I don't know, it was 50% or maybe somewhat less, in the Capitol Theater when things got really tough in the 30 and 31 and 32. He sold his interest in the theater for $1 and walked away from it. So anyway, he was, but at that time, they were the Saks, S-A-X-E theaters, was a chain operated out of Milwaukee, and the Orpheum was really quite a structure. All the architecture at that time for theaters was big on Moorish architecture. So everything from in the theater, of course, most of it is long gone now, but all the tile and the fountains and everything else all had to come from Seville, Spain. which really was supposed to impress the customers. But and it was really a shame to see all that stuff eliminated when the building was remodeled as a civic center to combine it with the Montgomery Ward store. But that's the way things happen. So that was the glorious end for the Capitol Theater, and it really has been put to very good use.
Now that makes me think of State Street. During the 1960s, when there was so much disturbance, civil disobedience, I guess one calls it, on State Street, how about your bank? I realize it was nearer the square than a lot of it, but were you affected by any of that?
We didn't have too many bad encounters at that time. The kids in the war zone were all on the lower State Street area, and even with the window trashings that went on for quite a while, we weren't affected until finally, near the end of the whole thing, one night we got each one of our main plate glass windows on State Street, all 5 of them, we got a rock through the window. And so that's when we put up the screens to cover that situation. But that was the only incident, and shortly after that, the whole thing blew over. And we, of course, enjoyed the marches up and down State Street from time to time. But really, nothing ever happened. We had very good rapport with the students. A lot of them cashed their checks with us, and we carried accounts with us. And we've always treated them as adult people who are supposed to know what they're doing, and we've never really had any real problems with students either then or later. Just as a brief summary, because some people might have remembered some of Dad's brothers and sisters, Dad was the oldest boy in the family. The number 2 boy was William Ponnock, who became quite an architect, and in fact his name and his co-partner who designed the home, which has been converted into the shop for Bethel Lutheran Church, was designed by him, and he has his name in a plaque out in the front yard there. Willie, whom I never knew, was quite a sportsman, along with my dad, and since they lived at the corner of Park and University Avenue, it was very handy for everybody in the neighborhood, the Motzes and everybody else, to keep their duck and fishing boats moored down at the end of Park Street, where the Union is now, because Picnic Point, of course, it was a great canvasback point, and I don't know if anybody knows anything about duck hunting. Of course, they all know what canvasback are. And so it was standard procedure back in those days for A.O. and Willie and I guess the Motzes and the Hobbinses and all the rest of the big shooters around town to go duck hunting on 4th Lake, better known as now as Mendota. And, of course, one of the prime shooting areas was Picnic Point. Well, it so happened, according to my dad, that one day in November, he and Willie, and I don't know who else was with him, I think Rip, the youngest brother, he hadn't gone to Annapolis yet, were out shooting cans off of Picnic Point, and somebody knocked down a big buck can as a cripple, so Willie volunteered to take the duck boat and go out after him, which he did. But he got the bird all right, but before just about the time he got back into shoreway, the boat swamped, and it was pretty cold and windy, so he was able to get ashore all right. And they started a bonfire to try to warm him up a little bit because the water was pretty cold. And they finally all packed up and went home. But Willie contacted pneumonia, and it was shortly, not too long after that, that he died from the pneumonia he contracted from chasing that old canvasback out in University Bay. And so the younger brother, Rip, after whom I'm named, Robert R., wanted to go to Annapolis. And he was kind of tall and skinny, and he couldn't pass the physical because they were very GI in those days about being the proper weight for your proper height. So after 2 or 3 examinations, and after, I think it was Bob LaFollette, old Bob, who had arranged an appointment to West Point for him, the situation had gotten rather desperate. So one of A.O.'s favorite stories was telling how he fattened up Rip on bananas and milk the day he went down for his 3rd and final weigh-in at the Armory somewhere, and for 2 days before he went down, Rip ate nothing but bananas till they came out of his ears, and he finally went down and passed the exam, and so Rip finally entered the Naval Academy and became interested in aviation. He was, when we buried him a couple years ago, he was going to be 93 on July 4th, which was his birthday, but he missed that by about 2 weeks, and he was 92 when he passed, almost 93 when he passed away. Arlene and I went down and at the funeral down at Pensacola, and he's buried on the grounds down there. He was very active in early naval aviation and was the first exec officer on the USS Langley, which was the first airplane carrier. He also was in the Naval Air Museum in Pensacola. They have his picture there in the first graduating class of Naval Air Cadets. And Rip spent a lot of time with dirigibles back in those days. One of his favorite stories is they were flying over Washington, D.C., and one of the motors, I guess they were in a 2-engine dirigible, and one of the motors caught fire, and he volunteered to climb out on the rigging with a fire extinguisher and put out the fire. And so he got they gave him not the Medal of Honor, but the some kind of a medal for doing that. And he served twice as a commandant of the Pensacola Air Base, and then retired and was called back for the big war out of retirement. And but he married a girl from Pensacola and spent the remaining years of his life down there after he got too old to go hunting and fishing out west on the Klamath River in Sun Valley. So then my and the girls all married local people here, except my Aunt Ida, who never did get married. But I guess about the last thing that A.O. would have wanted to see was the way State Street tapered off after the shopping centers went in, and I think it was 1980, 1963, I guess it was, wasn't it? When it was 73 when the shopping centers, Easttown and Westtown, went in and drained all the activity from downtown Madison. Things have starting to turn around, hopefully, with the new State Street and the mall and the concourse. We're now seeing considerable activity downtown again. Hopefully the trend will continue. The square, from a commercial point of view, is still a pretty bleak area. State Street itself shows lots of signs of activity and new vim and vigor. and maybe this will this trend will continue up around the square, and if we have enough staying power, why maybe this will all come back to the days when downtown Madison was the center of activity, and we are hopeful that we can regenerate some of those days again.